Hello everyone, Dark of All Trades here. Now, is there something that really bothers you so much that you can't help but think about it? Before I fall asleep, I usually decompress from my day and consider what I'm going to do the next day. And that brings me to today's video. Today's video comes from a large channel called needgod.net. It took a bit of looking, but I found on his website, which I probably could do an entire video on, that his name is Ryan. Well, today Ryan has a video titled "The Question That Keeps Atheists Up at Night." My initial thought is, there's no one question that keeps me up at night. Until recently, I worked third shift, so I was awake all night anyway. But I don't think any question had anything to do with helping me stay awake. Anyway, looking over his stuff, he seems to do a fair amount of live conversations, and this is one of them, so I'll try to give him as much leeway as I can for that. Though he seems to have a lot of practice street evangelizing, so maybe I'll give a little bit. For this video, it looks like Ryan is talking with two college gentlemen who have some questions for him. Now, I'm not sure how these people connected, or even if these two gentlemen are atheists or not, but that shouldn't really matter. So let's see what question keeps atheists up at night.
Only heaven silent for an answer.
Let's say you are correct with all the God stuff. How do you know that Christianity is that God? How do you know that Jesus was right? I'm not like disrespecting your religion.
No, these are great questions. Yeah, I'm glad you're asking it.
Now, I want to get to Ryan's answer, but I need to pause here for a moment, because this is an excellent question. I don't know these students or their experiences, but this question goes straight to the heart of the issue. So many apologists claim to know things and then try to justify that supposed knowledge by merely restating what they believe rather than explaining how they know it. Now, I've heard bad justifications like, "I read it in the Bible and I think the Bible is true." And that is a bad justification, but at least it's a justification. More often, though, I hear theists respond with something like faith. But faith isn't a justification at all. It's just saying, "I believe because I believe." Well, now let's get to Ryan's answer.
The reason why I know specifically it's Christianity is because what we observe from the universe is consistent with what Christianity teaches. Now, that's not unique just to Christianity, but the reason why it's specifically Christian is that God has come down in the person of Jesus. Jesus claimed to be God. Other people have claimed to be God too, but Jesus proved his claims by doing various miracles, rising from the dead 3 days after he died, and so on, when you don't have others who claim to be God doing things like that.
So there's a lot here, but he begins by claiming what we observe from the universe is consistent with what Christianity teaches. This requires some careful examination. First, we need to ask, which Christianity? With thousands of denominations holding contradictory interpretations of Scripture and nature, this claim lacks specificity. Catholics, Baptists, progressive Christians all understand creation differently, and they can't all be equally, quote, consistent with the universe, end quote. When examining biblical descriptions of reality, many scholars identify elements reflecting ancient Near East cosmology. Genesis presents creation in ways that, read literally, describe a firmament separating waters above from waters below, light before celestial bodies, and a global flood. While many modern Christians interpret these passages allegorically or through frameworks like theistic evolution, and it is worth noting that these imperative approaches developed largely in response to scientific discoveries that contradicted literal readings. What's particularly striking is the Bible's silence on knowledge beyond its time. If divinely inspired, why doesn't Scripture contain clear, verifiable information unknown to ancient writers? No explicit references to galaxies, microorganisms, DNA, or mathematical concepts beyond contemporary knowledge. Instead, its cosmology and natural history align remarkably well with what educated writers of the period might reasonably have known. He then pivots to Mr. Jesus' miracles and resurrection as proof of Christianity's validity. This approach represents circular reasoning, using claims within biblical text to validate the authority of those same texts. It's equivalent to saying, the Odyssey must be historically accurate because it describes Odysseus performing extraordinary feats. Regarding resurrection narratives, this is a complex territory to say the least, where scholarship remains divided. While some scholars, like Jonathan Z. Smith, emphasize the uniqueness of Mr. Jesus' bodily resurrection, others, such as Richard Carrier and Jennifer Wright Nust, note thematic parallels with figures like Osiris, Dionysus, and Baal in Mediterranean religions. What is accepted is the resurrection as a religious concept wasn't without precedent in the ancient world. More importantly, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. For public miracles that supposedly occurred before thousands, the contemporary historical record is surprisingly quiet. No accounts exist outside of the Gospels, which were written decades after the events by writers with theological commitments. Even Jewish historian Josephus' mention of Mr. Jesus, often cited by apologists, contains later Christian interpolations according to most textual scholars. Or, put simply, the addition of Mr. Jesus is generally considered a forgery. The fundamental problem with Ryan's argument is that he's attempting to validate Christianity using premises that already assume Christianity's truth, a classic example of begging the question in philosophical terms.
Wait, yes, my friend downstairs on this dorm claimed that he was God, and
Yeah.
well, he told me, and other people also told me, that we've seen him walk on water, make water into wine, and float and fly and do all these magic tricks. And they told me this. I can believe it. That's why I tell you this right now. I think he's God.
As strange or disingenuous as this response may sound, the student brilliantly exposes the circular logic in Ryan's argument with this dorm mate comparison. What's the difference between these two scenarios? In both cases, we have second-hand claims of miracles and divinity. The only real distinction is that one happened recently, while the other allegedly happened 2,000 years ago or so. Notice how quickly Ryan dismisses contemporary miracle claims while accepting ancient ones with far less evidence. If he rejects the dorm mate story, as he should without proper evidence, intellectual consistency demands similar skepticism towards ancient miracle claims that have even less documentation. This is why historians and scientists require extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. The student has created a parallel case argument that reveals Ryan's inconsistent standards, applying rigorous skepticism to modern miracle claims while giving ancient ones a free pass. If Ryan can't verify the dorm mate's divinity despite having access to living witnesses, how much more skeptical should he be about ancient accounts written decades after the events by non-eyewitnesses with theological agendas? Now, if you'd like a great response to this kind of point, check out David Hume's Of Miracles, which you can read for free online. I'll leave a link to it in the description.
The difference is that with Jesus, this is not just done in a corner. Two people saw this, and we just have to trust those two people. This is done in public. So many people saw his death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. It was a very public event, and many of his other miracles were public events.
Ryan claims Mr. Jesus' miracles were public events witnessed by many people, as if this strengthens their historical reliability. But this argument fundamentally misunderstands how historical evidence works. We don't have eyewitness accounts of these supposedly public events. What we have are stories claiming that these were public events, written decades after they allegedly occurred. The Gospels themselves weren't written until about 40 to 70 years after Mr. Jesus' death, though there are differences in opinion on which year, by anonymous authors who never claimed to be eyewitnesses. This distinction is pretty crucial. When a text says 500 people saw this miracle, that's not the same as having 500 independent testimonies. It's one claim about 500 people. If I write, 1,000 people saw me fly yesterday, that doesn't suddenly make it 1,000 times more credible. Historical claims require proper evidential support. For ordinary claims about ancient figures, historians look for things like multiple independent attestations, contemporary accounts, corroboration from neutral or hostile sources, archaeological confirmation, and contextual plausibility. For extraordinary claims like resurrection or miracle working, the evidential bar raises significantly higher. Yet for Mr. Jesus' miracles, we have no contemporary accounts, they're all written decades later, no neutral corroboration, only accounts from devoted followers, no archaeological evidence, and stories that evolved and grew more miraculous over time. The silence from contemporaries is particularly telling. Mr. Jesus supposedly performed spectacular public miracles in a region with literate Roman officials, Jewish scholars, and Greek chroniclers. Yet not one contemporary document mentions these events. Philo of Alexandria, a prolific Jewish writer who lived during the time of Mr. Jesus and discussed Jewish religious developments, never mentions him or his miracles. This isn't merely an argument from silence. As Bart Ehrman puts it, it's an argument from deafening silence, where documentation should exist but doesn't. If someone today claimed to have publicly raised the dead in Times Square last year, wouldn't you find it suspicious that not a single newspaper, social media post, or smartphone video documented it? His assertion that many people saw these events isn't historical evidence. It's simply repeating the claims made within the very texts whose reliability is in question.
How do you know so many people saw this event?
This is an excellent question. I hope these students keep pressing Ryan like this.
From the historical accounts, so we don't even just have records in the Bible about it, we have external sources from the Bible from the first century. recording the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Even the official Roman historian Tacitus records about it. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian from the 1st century, recording about these things.
Okay, now we're on to external sources like Tacitus and Josephus, as if they provide independent confirmation of Mr. Jesus' miracles and resurrection. This claim seriously misrepresents these historical references. Let's examine what these sources actually say. Tacitus, writing around 115 CE, which is 80 plus years after Mr. Jesus' death, briefly mentions that Christus was executed under Pontius Pilate. He's merely reporting what Christians at the time believed. He provides no confirmation of miracles or resurrection, and was born decades after the events in question. Josephus and the famous Testimonium Flavianum, written 93 to 94 CE, is widely recognized by scholars as containing later Christian interpolations. The original likely had minimal references to Mr. Jesus that was later embellished by Christian copyists. The second mention only refers to James, the brother of Mr. Jesus, called Christ, and offers no details about Mr. Jesus' life or deeds. More importantly, neither of these sources are contemporary. Both are written between 60 and 80 years after Mr. Jesus' supposed death by authors who had no first-hand knowledge of the events. They simply report the existence of Christians and aspects of what Christians believed. Now, this is an important distinction. Confirming that Christians existed and believed certain things about Mr. Jesus is completely different from confirming those beliefs were true. These sources no more verify the resurrection than Roman writings about Mithras verifying his miraculous birth from a rock. The absence of contemporary sources remains a significant historical problem. For someone who allegedly performed miracles and caused significant religious and political disruption, the complete silence from the writers of his time is historically anomalous and demands explanation.
Even the very people who said Jesus died and rose from the dead, they were even willing to be put to death for saying that Jesus died and rose from the dead. If they had just made up this idea just because they're playing a joke on people, they wouldn't have been willing to die for it. But instead we see them willing.
He now claims that early Christians wouldn't have died for something they knew was a lie. This martyrdom argument is perhaps the weakest in the apologetic arsenal, collapsing under even basic scrutiny. First, the argument creates a false dichotomy. Either the disciples were lying about everything, or they witnessed an actual resurrection. This ignores numerous other possibilities. They could have sincerely believed in a resurrection based on visions, hallucinations, or misinterpreted experiences. Stories about their martyrdom could have been exaggerated or legendary. They could have been mistaken rather than deliberately deceptive. Or the resurrection narrative might have evolved over time after their deaths. Second, we have remarkably little reliable information about how most of the disciples actually died. While Christian tradition claims most were martyred, these accounts come from texts written centuries later with clear theological agendas. The only disciple whose death is recorded in the New Testament is James in Acts 12:2, and nothing suggests he was offered a chance to recant. Third, people absolutely do die for false beliefs they sincerely hold. Heaven's Gate members, Jim Jones followers, and Heaven's Gate cultists all died for demonstrably false beliefs. September 11th hijackers died for religious convictions most Christians would consider false. Throughout history, people have died for contradictory religions, proving that willingness to die doesn't validate the truth of one's beliefs. Fourth, this argument backfires spectacularly when applied consistently. Mormons died for their faith. Muslims have martyrs. Buddhist monks self-immolate for their beliefs. By Ryan's logic, shouldn't these religions be equally valid? If he dismisses their martyrdoms while accepting Christian ones, he's engaging in special pleading. Finally, we don't even know if the disciples were offered a chance to recant specific claims about witnessing a resurrection. Being executed for general allegiance to a movement is different from being killed specifically for claiming to have seen something you know you didn't. The martyrdom argument isn't evidence for resurrection. It's evidence that some early Christians had sincere beliefs. Sincerity and accuracy are entirely different matters.
Why wouldn't they be willing to die?
How about
The same
how about
reason why, if you were to
Muhammad?
make up a lie today and someone was to say, look, either you recant that idea and you'll live, or otherwise you get killed for that, you'd be like, hey, look, I'm just messing around, I was making up something.
Ryan's response here assumes people always prioritize personal survival over other values, which history repeatedly disproves. People maintain falsehoods under threat of death for numerous reasons, like protecting family members, preserving a cause they believe transcends themselves, maintaining loyalty to a group, fear of shame or betraying comrades, or believing the lie serves a greater truth. It's a clear lack of critical thinking that shows through with this point. He also assumes that they would have known it was a lie. It could have been that they have convinced themselves it was true. There are a million reasons how this could have been the case, too. Maybe someone deceived them. How did Ryan rule this out? More importantly, as I mentioned before, we have no reliable historical evidence that any of Mr. Jesus' disciples were offered the specific choice: recant seeing the resurrection or die. The martyrdom stories come from much later traditions, not contemporary accounts. This is a textbook argument from incredulity. I can't imagine why someone would die for a lie, therefore they weren't lying. It substitutes personal imagination for historical evidence and psychological understanding. Even if we accept that some early Christians died for their beliefs, which is historically reasonable, this only demonstrates sincere conviction, not factual accuracy. The 909 followers of Jim Jones died for their beliefs. Heaven's Gate members died for theirs. Sincerity is not evidence of truth.
Because,
I'll get killed for that. I'll get killed for that. I'll do it.
well, now you're just being unreasonable.
Notice how quickly Ryan dismisses these students' counterpoint as unreasonable without explaining why. This is a telling moment that exposes the weakness in his entire argument. The student is demonstrating exactly why Ryan's logic fails. People can have motivations to maintain falsehoods even at great personal cost. By labeling this unreasonable without addressing it, Ryan reveals he has no substantial response. What's truly unreasonable is Ryan's refusal to apply consistent standards. Throughout history, people have died for causes, protected secrets, and maintained group loyalties at the cost of their lives. Intelligence agents, political dissidents, and members of resistance movements have all chosen death over betrayal. Ryan's dismissive response is special pleading. He's creating an exception to a principle without justification. He finds it reasonable when applied to disciples, but unreasonable when applied to anyone else. If Ryan had a strong argument, he would explain why the student's position is flawed rather than simply labeling it unreasonable. His inability to engage with this challenge reveals more about the weakness of his position than he likely intended.
How about, like, obviously a lot of people died for Muhammad. He claims that he saw the angel Gabriel, right? What do you have to refute that? That
Yeah.
isn't the same thing that you're saying about Jesus.
Good question. So what we have with Muhammad is the only one who's claiming, look, I saw an angel talk to me. And the others are just believing what Muhammad's saying. They're not actually witnessing it themselves, saying, yeah, we saw Muhammad talk to this angel. Many people do die for what they believe to be true. No doubt about that. But nobody dies for what they know is false. Something they know they've completely made up.
Ryan's attempt to distinguish between Muslim and Christian martyrs reveals a classic double standard in religious apologetics. Muhammad is the only one claiming, he asserts, implying Mr. Jesus had multiple eyewitnesses. But this misrepresents our historical sources. Like I said before, the Gospels were written between 40 and 70 years after Mr. Jesus' death by anonymous authors who never claimed to be eyewitnesses themselves. Mark, circa 70 CE, our earliest Gospel, originally ended with just an empty tomb. The detailed appearance stories emerged later in Matthew, Luke, and John. Ryan's contradiction becomes obvious when he says, many people die for what they believe to be true, but nobody dies for what they know is false. In one breath, he acknowledges martyrdom proof sincerity for Muslims, but then treats it as proof for factual truth for Christians. This shifting standard can't work both ways. What makes this particularly striking is that early Islamic sources record companions, like Abu Bakr, witnessing Muhammad's revelations, describing visible physical signs during these experiences. If martyrdom validates truth claims as Ryan suggests, wouldn't this authenticate Islam by the exact same reasoning? This selective application of evidence is failing the outsider test for faith. Ryan applies historical skepticism to Islam that he's unwilling to apply to Christianity, a methodological inconsistency that would be unacceptable in any other historical investigation. And that's the end of his video. So what is the question that keeps atheists up at night? What were his main points? Christianity is true because what we observe from the universe is consistent with what Christianity teaches. Mr. Jesus claimed to be God and proved his claims through miracles and resurrection. Mr. Jesus' death and resurrection were public events witnessed by many people. Historical accounts both within and outside the Bible confirm Mr. Jesus' crucifixion. The disciples were willing to die for their belief in Mr. Jesus' resurrection, which they wouldn't do if they knew it was false. This differs from Muhammad, who was the only one claiming to have seen Angel Gabriel, others believed without witnessing. Nobody dies for what they know is false. His points felt a bit repetitive, but fairly basic at best. I think the students asked some great questions. Though, do you think they should have asked different questions? How would you have handled Ryan's points here? Would you have responded with different points than I did? Let me know in the comments below. Overall, I give Ryan a 9 facepalmy Mr. Jesuses out of 10. His arguments suffer from a combination of historical inaccuracy, logical inconsistency, and rhetorical evasion. Rather than engaging with the counterarguments in good faith, he repeatedly dismisses challenges without justification, as seen when he labels a valid counterpoint as unreasonable instead of addressing it. He also employs selective skepticism, applying scrutiny to Islam while taking Christian sources at face value, despite both relying on later traditions rather than contemporary eyewitness testimony. His reasoning is internally inconsistent. He acknowledges that people die for sincerely held false beliefs, but then assumes Christian martyrs must have been dying for the truth. This double standard and unwillingness to grapple with historical complexities makes his argument fundamentally weak. While his position aligns with common apologetic rhetoric, so at least he didn't completely make it up, it fails as a serious academic or philosophical defense, earning him this failing grade for severe flaws in reasoning, lack of engagement, and intellectual dishonesty. That's it for this one. So now I'm turning this over to you. Do you think I responded with tact, but didn't let Ryan get away with any shenaniganery? Or do you think I let something go I shouldn't have? Let me know in the comments below. Though if you would label my responses as reasonable, hit that like button to show the world your reasoning. Though if you'd like to get more of my contemporary information that shows I exist, giving me one or more points over Mr. Jesus, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already to give my content more historical context. Speaking of historic, I need to give a monumentous thanks to my patrons, Clarice Anima and Sora, as well as the rest of you monuments to momentum. If you would like to be contextually plausible, you can join them for as low as $1 a month at patreon.com/darkofalltrades. Thank you to all of you who have already subscribed, liked, shared a video on their social medias. Everything like that helps me get my content to more people all over the world. I appreciate you. And as always, keep learning.
So that's why my religion